He was already 3 days dead when the world finally noticed. Kurt Cobain, the voice of a generation that never asked for one, the man who made alienation sound like salvation, had been lying in a greenhouse above his garage since Tuesday while MTV still played his videos and radio stations still spun his songs and millions of fans still wore his face on their chests without knowing they were already mourning a ghost. Lake Washington Boulevard, Seattle, April 8, 1994, Friday morning. The rain had stopped, unusual for Seattle in spring, almost like the city itself was holding its breath. An electrician arrived at the lakeside house to install security lighting, climbed the stairs above the garage and saw through the greenhouse glass what he first thought was a mannequin sprawled on the floor. The 911 call came in at 8:40 a.m. "There's a body in the greenhouse. I think it's Kurt Cobain." Seattle police arrived within minutes, secured the scene, found the shotgun positioned across the body, found the suicide note written in increasingly shaky handwriting, addressed to Boda, an imaginary friend from childhood because real friends had stopped understanding him years ago. Found evidence of heroin use so extensive that the medical examiner would later note the amount in his system should have rendered him unconscious before he could have pulled any trigger. That detail would haunt investigators, would fuel conspiracy theories for decades, would make people ask, how does someone with enough heroin to kill a horse still have the physical capability to execute such a violent act? Was this really suicide or something darker? But officially the ruling was clear. Self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. Suicide, another member of the 27 Club, another artist who burned too bright and burned out exactly when the mythology said he would. The crowd thought he was invincible, or at least that his pain was performance. They didn't know he'd been dying in public for years, that every scream was a cry for help disguised as rock and roll, that fame had built a prison around him and he'd finally found the only exit that felt real. The greenhouse is a crime scene now, though there's no crime except the violence of a person against themselves. A note on the floor addressed to Boda, the imaginary friend from childhood who apparently understood him better than any real person ever could. A shotgun, evidence of heroin use, so much heroin that most people would have been unconscious before they could pull a trigger, which will fuel conspiracy theories for decades. But the medical examiner rules it suicide. The Seattle police agree. Case closed officially. A 27-year-old rock star dead by his own hand, and the only mystery is why everyone acts surprised when he'd been telegraphing this ending in every interview, every lyric, every performance where he looked like he was barely holding himself together. "It's better to burn out than to fade away," the note quotes Neil Young. As if Kurt hadn't been doing both simultaneously, burning out while fading away, disappearing in public, dying slowly on stages in front of thousands who thought they were watching a performance when they were actually witnessing a long goodbye. Was this really suicide? The inevitable end of someone who'd been uncomfortable in his own skin since childhood? Or was it something more complex, a murder by fame, by expectation, by a culture that lionized pain while offering no path to healing? The Seattle Police Department said suicide. The medical examiner agreed. But questions lingered, would later obsess conspiracy theorists for decades. The amount of heroin in his system, some argued, was too high for him to have physically pulled the trigger. No legible fingerprints on the gun. The note's ending written in different handwriting, some claimed. Courtney Love's involvement questioned, though never substantiated. But maybe the how matters less than the why. Maybe Kurt Cobain didn't need a conspiracy to die. Maybe he'd been dying publicly for years and everyone was too busy making him into a symbol to notice he was actually a person drowning. But to understand how the voice stopped in a Seattle greenhouse, we must first understand how it began. In Aberdeen, in poverty, in a boy who felt everything too intensely for a world that wanted him to feel nothing at all. Aberdeen, Washington, February 20th, 1967. Post-industrial timber town on the coast where rain fell like punishment and the economy was collapsing and families held on by threads that kept fraying. In Aberdeen, noise meant escape, a scream, a promise. Kurt Donald Cobain was born to Donald and Wendy Cobain. Working-class family. Father was a mechanic, mother a waitress. They fought constantly. The kind of fighting where walls shake and children learn to make themselves small and quiet is survival. He learned early that silence is survival. The guitar was his way to make silence scream. Kurt was a sensitive child. Not in the gentle, passive way. Sensitive like exposed nerve endings, like someone born without the protective layer most people develop between self and world. He felt everything. Other kids' cruelty, his parents' unhappiness, the weight of existing in a body that hurt constantly even when nothing was technically wrong. At 7, he was diagnosed with ADHD. They put him on Ritalin. It didn't help. Made him feel more disconnected, more wrong, more like the problem was fundamental rather than chemical. At 8, his parents divorced. It shattered something in him that never fully reformed. The silence roared through Aberdeen rain. He answered with a guitar his uncle gave him. After the divorce, he bounced between relatives. Stayed with his father, who remarried quickly. Felt like an inconvenience. Stayed with his mother, who struggled to keep herself together, let alone a kid who was already showing signs of being difficult. Rebellious, artistic, unwilling to pretend everything was fine. He learned to make silence scream. He discovered punk rock at 14. The Melvins, a local band, became his obsession. Not because the music was technically good, it wasn't by conventional standards, but because it was angry and loud and unapologetic. Because it said that being weird and poor and pissed off was valid, that you didn't have to be polite about pain. He started playing guitar seriously, taught himself by playing along to songs, by writing his own, by using noise as language when words failed. His songs were angry and melodic simultaneously. Beauty wrapped in distortion, sweetness delivered through screaming. At 16, he dropped out of high school. Not because he was stupid, he was intelligent, well-read, artistic, but because school felt like training for a life he didn't want. He lived with friends in his car sometimes, anywhere he could crash. Aberdeen had nothing for him. No future, no opportunities, just the same cycle of poverty and disappointment his parents had lived. He worked minimum wage jobs when he had to. Janitor, maintenance. Jobs that paid just enough to buy guitar strings and cigarettes. Spent his free time playing music, drawing, writing in journals that were part diary, part manifesto, part art project. Pages filled with lyrics and sketches of anatomical hearts and distorted figures and the word hate written over and over until it lost meaning. Could that boy in Aberdeen have guessed that his scream would become the sound of a generation? That his discomfort would be packaged and sold to millions? That he'd become exactly the kind of commercial success he was rebelling against? In 1987, Kurt met Chris Novoselic, another Aberdeen misfit. Tall, gangly, into punk and metal and the same kind of aggressive, cathartic noise Kurt was making. They started jamming, added drummers, went through several before finding Dave Grohl in 1990. Called themselves Nirvana because Kurt liked how the word meant both heaven and nothingness, enlightenment and void. They played shows in basements and dive bars. Seattle's underground scene in the late 80s was fertile ground for exactly the kind of music they were making. Loud, aggressive, but melodic underneath. Not quite punk, not quite metal. Later, some genius in marketing would call it grunge and ruin everything by naming it. Their first album, Bleach, came out in 1989 on Sub Pop Records. Cost $600 to record. Sounded raw, unpolished, real. Sold moderately well in the underground scene. Got them touring. Nothing about it suggested they'd be anything more than another cult band that hardcore fans knew about and everyone else ignored. Then they signed to DGC Records, major label. Butch Vig producing. Nicer studio, bigger budget, and something shifted. Not intentionally. Kurt was still writing the same kinds of songs, still pulling from the same well of alienation and anger and pain. But the production made it more accessible, made it possible for mainstream audiences to hear what underground audiences had been hearing for years. Nevermind came out September 24th, 1991. Lead single, a song Kurt had written about teenage rebellion and apathy and how both felt futile. 3 chords, loud, quiet, loud dynamics, melody so infectious it was almost pop. Lyrics deliberately nonsensical because meaning was less important than feeling. The song was called Smells Like Teen Spirit, and it detonated like a cultural bomb. The water rose in Seattle. Kurt tried to swim, but the current pulled him under. Within months, Smells Like Teen Spirit was everywhere. MTV played the video constantly. Radio stations that normally ignored alternative rock were forced to play it because their listeners demanded it. The album went platinum, then multi-platinum. Nirvana went from playing clubs to playing arenas, from sleeping in vans to tour buses. And Kurt hated it. Not the success exactly. He wasn't immune to validation. But what the success meant. He'd written a song about alienation and it became a jock anthem. Fraternity parties played it. The people he'd been rebelling against were singing along. The authenticity was being packaged and sold, and he was complicit. They asked him to scream on cue. "It feels like being hugged by strangers who don't know you're bleeding," he told MTV when they asked how fame felt. He was 24 years old and already exhausted by being himself in public. Was the success they achieved truly worth the cage it built? Can you be the voice of authenticity in an industry built on fakeness? Does speaking for outsiders make you an insider, and if so, what do you become? The early 90s were a blur of touring, recording, interviews, photo shoots, all the machinery of rock stardom grinding Kurt into something marketable. He showed up to MTV unplugged in ripped jeans and a cardigan. They wanted to present Nirvana as the future of rock. He wanted to play lead belly covers and make it look like a funeral. "I want it to look like a funeral," he told the production team when they asked about staging. They thought he was being artistic. He was being literal. Behind all that fame, was there an unbearable loneliness nobody acknowledged? Can you be adored by millions and still feel like no one actually sees you? In 1992, Kurt married Courtney Love, lead singer of Hole. Another musician, another misfit, another person who'd grown up feeling wrong and used music as survival. They fell in love fast and hard, the kind of love that's passionate and destructive simultaneously. That feels like finding someone who finally understands but also like enabling each other's worst impulses. Before shows, he'd line up the picks on his amp like tiny soldiers, a ritual of control in a life that kept exploding. They had a daughter, Frances Bean, in August 1992. Kurt loved her immediately and desperately. Saw in her a chance to be a better father than his own had been, to give her stability and love and presence. But he was also deep in heroin addiction by then, and Courtney was fighting her own battles with substances, and suddenly Child Protective Services was investigating and the whole mess became public. The media loved it. Grunge's golden couple revealed to be junkies with a baby. The authenticity Kurt had sold became ammunition against him. How dare he be messy in real life after making millions singing about being messy? How dare his pain be actual pain rather than marketable angst? He tried to get clean. Checked into rehab multiple times, would stay sober for weeks, then relapse. The pattern familiar to anyone who's loved an addict. Hope, disappointment, hope, disappointment. Until hope itself becomes exhausting. But he kept making music. In Utero came out in 1993, darker than Nevermind, more abrasive, deliberately uncommercial in places because Kurt was trying to shed the mainstream audience that had latched onto him. Trying to return to the underground, to authenticity, to making music for people who actually got it rather than people who thought he was just another rock star. The album opened with a song about teenage pregnancy and abortion. Included tracks that were intentionally harsh and noisy. Had a title that means, In the Womb, New Life or Tomb depending on how you heard it. Critics loved it, fans were divided. It went platinum anyway because by then Kurt could have released an album of himself screaming into the void and it would have sold millions. He was trapped. Success meant betraying his values, failure meant poverty and obscurity. There was no path that felt authentic, no choice that didn't feel like compromise. Once the world made him a prophet, he couldn't just be a person anymore. MTV Unplugged in New York was recorded November 18, 1993. Nirvana playing acoustic, no hits. Kurt refused to play Teen Spirit or most of their well-known songs. Instead, covers of obscure bands and deeper album cuts. The staging exactly what he'd asked for. Dim, intimate, decorated with lilies and candles. A funeral for something not yet dead. He looked terrible. Thin, pale, hair uncombed, wearing a cardigan that was too big. But when he sang, something happened. The raw pain that usually got buried under distortion was naked now. Vulnerable. His voice cracking on certain notes not because he was a bad singer, but because he was barely holding himself together. The final song was a lead belly cover. Where Did You Sleep Last Night? Traditional murder ballad about infidelity and violence and death in the pines. Kurt sang it like confession, like the lyrics were about him even though they were written a century earlier by someone else. The final note, he screamed it, face contorting, eyes squeezed shut, every muscle tense like he was trying to expel something poisonous from his body. When he finished, silence. The production team wanted to do another take. Kurt said no. I can't do it again. Walked off set. That scream was all he had left. The sun never obeyed Seattle. It just reminded Kurt what warmth felt like before taking it away. The first months of 1994 were crisis mode. Kurt overdosed in Rome in March, took 50 Rohypnol pills, fell into a coma. Courtney found him. Hospital saved him. The official story called it an accident. People close to him wondered if it was a practice run. He came back to Seattle, checked into rehab again. Lasted 2 days before climbing over the fence and disappearing. His mother filed a missing persons report. Private investigators looked for him. Friends called anyone who might know where he was. He was at his Lake Washington house the whole time. Alone, in the greenhouse above the garage, with his drug dealer's shotgun and enough heroin to kill him before the bullet could, and a note he'd been writing for possibly weeks. His daughter was at his mother's house, safe, loved, protected from whatever was about to happen. Frances Bean was 19 months old, young enough that she wouldn't remember her father directly, only through stories and photographs and music that would surround her forever. Once before Frances was born, someone asked Kurt about fatherhood. He said, I want to give her everything I didn't have. Stability, love, safety. I want her to know she's wanted. She asked him once in the way toddlers ask everything, Daddy, why you sad? He smiled, not the stage smile, the real one. Because that's how I sing, baby, sad makes the music work. Did this period mark his inevitable end? Or the moment when intervention could have saved him? April 8, 1994. The electrician found him, called 911. Police arrived. The scene was simultaneously dramatic and mundane. A dead rock star and also just a dead person, body doing what bodies do, violence and aftermath and the mechanics of mortality. The note was examined. Long rambling addressed to his imaginary childhood friend because maybe the only person who really understood him was someone who'd never existed. It quoted Neil Young, thanked his family, apologized to his fans for not being able to perform authenticity anymore, told Frances to stay happy, to choose a life better than his. The last line, some say, was written in different handwriting. Courtney always denied it. Conspiracy theorists built elaborate theories. The truth, as always, was probably simpler and sadder. A man who'd been dying slowly finally died quickly, and everyone wanted to make it mean something more than pain reaching its conclusion. The news spread instantly. Seattle radio stations played Nirvana albums on repeat. Fans gathered at his house at the Space Needle in parks, crying and holding vigils. Courtney held a public memorial, read from the note, screamed at him for leaving. 10 days later, Nirvana's bass player found a fan who'd killed himself in tribute, wearing a Nirvana shirt, method identical. Were these final decisions acts of surrender? Or the only choice available to someone who'd lost the ability to see other options? What is Kurt Cobain's legacy? The music, obviously. 3 studio albums that defined a decade. Songs that became anthems for alienation. A voice that made pain sound not just valid but necessary. The proof that you could be commercially successful without selling out, except you couldn't really because success itself was the sellout, was the betrayal of everything you'd claimed to value. But his legacy is also the question he forced. What do we owe our artists? Are we loving them or consuming them? Supporting them or feeding on their pain? Fame doesn't kill its prophets. It just makes them responsible for everyone else's emptiness while ignoring their own. We turned confession into a genre and called it grunge. After Kurt died, grunge died with him. Not immediately. Bands kept making music, Seattle kept having a scene. But the cultural moment ended. The authenticity he'd represented got replaced by irony, by manufactured pop punk, by the very commercialization he'd been fighting against. Courtney got blamed. Unfairly, viciously, in ways that revealed how much people needed a villain. How much easier it was to say she killed him than to acknowledge he'd been killing himself for years. And fame had been pulling the trigger slowly. Dave Grohl went on to form Foo Fighters. Chris Novoselic did various musical projects, eventually pivoted to political activism. Dave once told Kurt years before the end, "You don't owe them every scream." And Kurt laughed. They paid for it. Neither talked much about Kurt for years. Too painful, too complicated, too impossible to explain what it was like watching someone you loved become a martyr while still alive. Frances Bean grew up without her father, surrounded by his ghost. The estate made millions off his image, his face on t-shirts, his music in commercials, his art in galleries, everything he'd hated about commodification happening posthumously. She eventually sued Courtney, got her father's guitar, tried to maintain some relationship with who he actually was versus who the culture made him. His suicide note became religious text for a generation. Kids quoted it in yearbooks, got it tattooed, used "it's better to burn out than to fade away" as justification for their own darkness. Missing that Kurt was quoting someone else, that the note was more complicated than that one line, that using a suicide note as life advice is precisely the kind of irony Kurt would have hated. Music critics reevaluated his work constantly, found depths they'd missed initially, realized songs they'd thought were simple were actually complex, but also couldn't separate the work from the death, couldn't hear the music without hearing it as prelude to suicide. Every lyric became prophetic in retrospect. Every expression of pain became evidence of inevitable ending. "I'm not scared of dying," he'd written in his journal in 1993. "I'm scared of becoming empty." He was 26 when he wrote that. 1 year from death, already understanding that the choice wasn't between life and death, but between dying slowly while everyone watched or dying quickly on his own terms. His story is particularly haunting because intervention was possible. People tried, Courtney, his management, his friends, multiple rehab stays. But you can't save someone who doesn't want saving, who sees salvation as just another trap, who understands that the pain isn't a bug in the system but a feature of his particular consciousness. The noise ended, but the echo didn't. It just changed shape, from music to myth, from person to symbol. The scream kept going after he stopped. Every year on April 5th, fans gather in Seattle. Some at his house, no longer owned by Courtney, now just a regular house where regular people live, but still a pilgrimage site. Some at Veretta Park nearby where there's a bench and usually flowers and often a guitar someone's left. They play Nirvana songs, cry, take photos, treat it like visiting a saint's shrine. Kurt Live's graffiti appears on walls throughout Seattle, has since the week he died, gets painted over, reappears. Like the city itself can't let him go, can't stop insisting he's still somehow present, still speaking for those who feel unheard. Musicians cite him constantly. Every outsider who makes it big references him as permission. Every artist who struggles with success versus authenticity invokes his ghost. He's become the patron saint of refusing to play the game even though he did play the game just badly, just in ways that hurt him. Is that there's a club, unofficial morbid, called the 27 Club. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Amy Winehouse, and Kurt, all dead at 27, all from substance-related deaths or suicides. All mythologized as proof that genius burns too bright to last, when really they're proof that we don't know how to care for artists beyond consuming their pain. He reclaimed his silence, not by escaping the noise, but by choosing when to stop listening. Near the end of his life, Kurt recorded home demos. Simple songs, acoustic guitar, his voice without the production. They were released years later. One included his daughter's voice in the background, Frances Bean as a toddler, making baby sounds, present in her father's art the way she couldn't be in his life for much longer. He wanted to survive through singing. Instead, he taught us how to recognize pain in others' voices, how to understand that art made from suffering isn't romantic, it's desperate. How to see that when someone's telling you they're drowning, believing them matters more than buying their albums. Tom Morello said of Chris Cornell, "He had the most beautiful voice in rock, and it killed him." For Kurt Cobain, it was rawer but no less deadly. He had the most honest voice in rock, and honesty became unbearable when everyone was listening. In Roca di Papa, water became memory, quiet, and forgiveness. So here's the question that remains. Does giving voice to a generation's pain mean taking responsibility for healing it? When we elevate artists who speak our struggles, are we helping them or mining them? Is there a way to love tortured art without romanticizing torture? Can authenticity survive commodification, or does commercial success always betray the values that created the success? And here's the question for you. When you listen to music made by someone in obvious pain, Kurt screaming, Elliot whispering, Chris reaching impossible notes, are you hearing art or autobiography? Are you moved by the skill or the suffering? And if it's the suffering that moves you, what does that say about what we value in artists? About whether we actually want them to heal? Kurt died at 27 with a shotgun and a note. But he'd been dying since Aberdeen, since his parents' divorce, since the first time he realized he felt everything too intensely for a world built on numbness. The gun was just the final symptom of a disease nobody knew how to treat. Being sensitive in a culture that mistakes sensitivity for weakness. Here's what I want to know from you. If you could go back to 1994 knowing what you know now, what would you say to Kurt Cobain? Would you tell him his music matters? That millions found comfort in his pain? Or would you tell him none of that matters as much as staying alive? That being a voice for others isn't worth losing your own? And the harder question, if an artist has to choose between creating honest work that destroys them or making safer art that feels like lying, what should they choose? What would you choose? Does your answer change depending on whether you're the artist or the audience? Let me know in the comments. Because this conversation, the one Kurt started with his music and ended with his death, it's not resolved. Every generation has its Kurt Cobain, its artist who burns too bright, who speaks uncomfortable truths, who can't reconcile authenticity with survival. And every generation asks the same questions. Could we have saved them? Should we have loved them less intensely? Is their art worth what it cost them? And if pain keeps writing our favorite songs, will we ever learn to change the melody? But here's what I really want to know from you. When you listen to Nirvana now, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, Heart-Shaped Box, Do you hear music or do you hear a man screaming for help? Can you separate the art from the artist's pain? And should you? If Kurt were alive today, scrolling through social media, seeing how mental health conversations have changed, how addiction is understood differently, how artists are sometimes allowed to be vulnerable without it being commodified. Do you think he would have made it? Or was he always going to be a casualty of being too sensitive for a world that mistakes sensitivity for weakness? And here's the question that haunts me. We say, it's better to burn out than to fade away, like it's poetry, like it's noble. But what if it's just wrong? What if the real courage isn't in the dramatic exit, but in the messy, unglamorous work of staying alive? What if fading away, getting older, getting quieter, making less important art is actually more punk rock than dying young? What do you think? Was Kurt's death inevitable, or did we, the fans, the industry, the culture, fail him? Could one more person saying, "You don't owe us your pain," have made a difference? Or was he too far gone by the time anyone realized how serious it was? Drop your thoughts below. Because the only way we stop losing our Kurts, our Elliots, our Amys is if we start having honest conversations about what we demand from artists and what we're willing to give back. About whether we love them for their music or for their suffering. About whether fame is a platform or a prison. The rain still falls in Seattle. Sometimes, when it's particularly heavy, locals say Kurt weather and everyone knows what they mean. That specific gray that makes you feel everything and nothing simultaneously. That wetness that gets inside you and stays. And somewhere in someone's garage, a kid who feels too much is picking up a guitar for the first time. Learning 3 chords, writing songs that hurt to sing. Not knowing yet whether music will save them or become one more thing they can't survive. The gun went silent. But the scream that was equal parts rage and pain and a desperate plea to be understood, that scream is still echoing. In every basement show, every bedroom recording, every person who picks up an instrument because words aren't enough to express what's inside them. Kurt Cobain didn't want to be a voice for a generation. He just wanted to not hurt so much. But the hurt is what made the voice, and the voice is what made him immortal, and immortality is what killed him. Maybe that's the real lesson. Not that pain makes great art, but that sometimes the cost of great art is too high. That we, the audience, have a responsibility to love artists as people rather than products. That it's better to burn out than to fade away is the lie of people who've never actually done either. Kurt burned out. And we're still here in the smoke, trying to understand what the fire was trying to tell us before it consumed itself. Rain for mercy, sound for warning, fire for memory. The rain still falls in Seattle. Sometimes when it's particularly heavy, locals say Kurt weather and everyone knows what they mean. That specific gray that makes you feel everything and nothing simultaneously. That wetness that gets inside you and stays. And somewhere in someone's garage, a kid who feels too much is picking up a guitar for the first time. Learning 3 chords. Writing songs that hurt to sing. Not knowing yet whether music will save them or become one more thing they can't survive. The scream that was equal parts rage and pain and a desperate plea to be understood. That scream is still echoing. In every basement show. Every bedroom recording. Every person who picks up an instrument because words aren't enough to express what's inside them. Kurt Cobain didn't want to be a voice for a generation. He just wanted to not hurt so much. But the hurt is what made the voice, and the voice is what made him immortal. And immortality is what killed him. Then the rain swallows the echo, and for a heartbeat, Seattle forgets how to make noise. But here's what I really want to know from you. When you listen to Nirvana now, Smells Like Teen Spirit, Come As You Are, Heart-Shaped Box. Do you hear music or do you hear a man screaming for help? Can you separate the art from the artist's pain? And should you? If Kurt were alive today, scrolling through social media, seeing how mental health conversations have changed, how addiction is understood differently, how artists are sometimes allowed to be vulnerable without it being commodified, Do you think he would have made it? Or was he always going to be a casualty of being too sensitive for a world that mistakes sensitivity for weakness? And here's the question that haunts me. We say it's better to burn out than to fade away, like it's poetry, like it's noble. But what if it's just wrong? What if the real courage isn't in the dramatic exit, but in the messy, unglamorous work of staying alive? What if fading away, getting older, getting quieter, making less important art is actually more punk rock than dying young? What do you think? Was Kurt's death inevitable, or did we, the fans, the industry, the culture, fail him? Could one more person saying you don't owe us your pain have made a difference? Or was he too far gone by the time anyone realized how serious it was?